Let's talk about relationships in Laravel. So Laravel offers a lot of relationships, and there is a lot of long list in the relationships, and we are going to cover some of the most important and that are very frequently used in our web applications. So we start with by a one-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-many, and then the inverse of one-to-many, which is basically the belongs to. Then we have has one through, has many through. The other important is basically the polymorphic relationships. Most of the people, what they do is basically they learn most of these things, most of these relationships, but they do not focus or emphasize on these polymorphic relationships. And trust me that these polymorphic relationships are really important, and they very come in handy when there is a lot of dynamic relationships creating within one table. So I will explain you further down in the videos when we reach at this point, but let's now start with the first basic relationship, which is called one-to-one. So a best example of one-to-one relationship is basically a user has one national identity number. Alright, so national identity number is only belongs, the one national identity number is only basically belongs to one user. So one number cannot be linked to multiple people. So this is best example of one-to-one relationship. So how we do create this one-to-one relationship? So we have a users table here. So let's create a migration, and in that migration I'm going to call it PHP artisan make me a migration and create underscore user underscore um, NI table. So NI means national identity number. Alright, so I'm going to hit enter, and we are going to create a one string column which will be basically unique, and obviously that will also contain the user ID as well. So first of all, I'm going to make sure that this has a foreign ID, and the foreign ID will be the user underscore ID. Secondly, this table also must contain the string, which is basically the let's say identity number, and this will always be unique. Okay, so this can never be repeated. Now one more thing is that we need to define a relationship. So I'm going to say foreign, and that would be on user ID, and this will reference the ID on users table, and the optionals are cascade on update and cascade on delete. Obviously that basically depends on scenarios how you want to perform these cascading relationships. Alright, so let's run the migration first, and I'm going to say PHP artisan migrate. Once done, so you can see that this table has been created, and if I reload the page, this database here, so you see we now have user underscore NI. Now one more thing that we need to do is basically we need to create a model for that as well. So I'm going to say PHP artisan make model, and that would be user NI. Okay, like so, and this has been successfully created. Now let's try to insert some record here, and obviously we have a lot of users, so I'm going to basically just insert manually one or two records. So let's click on insert, and here we have a user ID. We can also browse the foreign values from here as well. You can see that we have a bunch of options available, so clicking on that will automatically bring the ID of the user, and this identity number would be, let's say this is the identity number, just for an example. And let's also put the values in the date column. Now if I click on go, so the record has been inserted, and you can see we now have the identity number here. Now how do we perform a relationship that the user, it gives us the user identity number? So let's go into our web function here, and let's create a route as well. So down here at the bottom, so I'm going to say route get, and I will name it as 1-to-1, and I'm going to pass the callback function within this route, because I don't want to create a separate controller for that. So if I say, let's say the user and user with basically, so let's say user find and the ID is 868. Okay, if I now dump and die this user and I hit the URL of 1-to-1, before that we actually make sure that the application is running. Okay, actually we are logged in, so this is not allowing me to go to this route, so I will paste it as globally here. Now let me just copy this one again. Okay, so now you see we now have attributes here, and inside that we have ID, name, email, and stuff like that. We do not have this relationship with this table. So all we need to do is basically inside the users table, let's define a relationship. So down here, I will say public function, and whatever the function name you want to give it, obviously that should be justifiable, so that justifies like what this function will do. So in other, if any other developer comes and see, okay, so this is the function, and that's the that's the functionality of this function method. Okay, so I will say identity, and I will return $this. Now I will say, so user has one identity number, so I will say has one. Okay, and inside that I'm going to say user NI. So this model that we have created, I'm going to reference that. And if I open the user NI, so this has nothing except this is just a model. Okay, again, now if I reload the page, I still see nothing here. Obviously we did have created the function here, but that didn't mean that we obviously going to get the first identity. So all we need to do is, if I just now go to the web here, so I can point to the identity method. Okay, now if I reload, I have now got an error. So this says that just to keep this thing in mind, that all the models that we create, they expect that the table ending word or the table name is in plural. So in that case we have a singular name. So all we can do is basically we can use protected table, and the table name is user_ni. So in that way this will basically target the user_ni instead of ni's. If I now reload and I go to the attributes here, now you can see we have a user, we have the identity number, and we have the other information. But there is one more thing, is that the user general or main information is now missing here. So what we can do is basically, instead of following this approach, obviously this does work, this will give us the identity, the relationship of the user, but the other thing is basically we can find, and we can say, okay, initially we can say user with and then find. Okay, so inside the with I am going to say identity. So this user should also get me the identity as well. Now if I reload, and now if I see here, obviously actually we now have the user here, but if I also say $user and identity, and if I reload, I now see the identity separately here and the user separately here as well. But what if I want that the user information and the user identity should be within the same here? So if you take a look at here in the relationships, in the attributes section and in the relationships, we now have a relationship one here. So if I remove this one and go back to the original one, we see the attributes which contain all these user information. Additionally, we also see a relation here as well. Now if I click on that and expand it, you can see that this basically object is also giving me a relation as well. So I can just quickly echo out the user name, user email address and the user identity number. So let me just do that. So I'm going to say echo, so user name, and that username would be username, and then I'm going to put some PR tags just to make sure that everything is on new line, and just replicate the stuff. So email. Now in order to get the identity, what I need to do is basically I need to first target my function or the relationship, and then I need to use the column here. So now if I refresh the page, you can see now we have the name of the user, the user name, this should be user email, and identity number. You can see now we have the identity number, user email, and then username. Let's say I use another function, another ID of the user which does not exist. So in that case we have a user one. So let's take this as an example, and if I reload, you see that we have the name and the email printed up top here. Let me just remove the upper bar so that it's visible to us. This one. Now you can see I have got the user email and user name, but I have also thrown me an error which says attempt to read property identity number on null. Now this means that this relationship is returning null to us. So if we take a look at here again, so I just say dump and add to user, reload the page. Now you see inside the relation we have one here, but if I click on that, the identity is basically null. So this is not giving me any further object. So all we can do in order to avoid such kind of errors, it's always a best practice to use null space operator. So what is a null space operator? That automatically identifies if the function is not null, get this value. If if the object is not null, get this column or key. Otherwise, just show nothing here. So all I need to do is basically I will say we do have the identity here. Okay, so that's not a big problem. So I'm going to use the question mark before the arrow sign. Now if I reload one more time, you now see the identity is empty. Okay, so that's how the one-on-one relationship works. I hope so that this brief video gave you a full information of how the one-on-one relationship works. And the other thing is basically you can reverse the relationship. How to reverse a relationship? Let's say for an instance, I want to fetch the identity number, and with that I also want to fetch the user. So this scenario works really well. Let me just put back the ID which we had here of the user, so 868. So 868. Reload the page. We now have the identity. Let's say I want to fetch the identity, but I also want to fetch the user of that identity as well. So how can I do that? Okay, let's just comment this out, and let's say I want to get the identity, and in order to get the identity I will use user ni, and I will say uh, where, and inside the where I will say user underscore id is 868, and I want to say okay, take the first one. Now if I dump and die the identity, I reload the page, I now see the identity with this user ID, but I do not see anything relation inside the relation array. And what I can do is basically, for instance, the thing that comes to your mind is basically I can target the user here. Okay, is that so? If I just reload, you see we got null here. Why is that? Because the user does not exist. The relationship is not defined. With the user, we define the relationship of identity, but we haven't created its reverse. For instance, because the reverse is somehow important if you want to go back from the child to the parent. Okay, so in that case, what I'm going to do is basically I'm going to say public function and user. All right, and I will say return $this. Now this basically function or this identity is belongs to a user, so I'm going to say belongs to user and class. Okay, so automatically this, because the relationship I have defined is in such a way that I used user underscore id, so this will automatically target our users table, and inside the users table this will target the id here. Now we have defined a user here, and if I go back here, now let's basically initially let's say I want to get the identity. Reload the page. Initially what we did is basically we just got the user identity, which is basically we are now back to our original concept. Now I also want to say give me the user as well. So with this approach I now see a relations here. Inside the relations I now see a user object, and inside that I have all the user information. Now I can follow the same approach here. Let's copy, paste it down here and uncomment everything. The only difference that we need to make sure is that we use the identity and then the user here, because we are now going reverse. And question mark is really important because sometimes user might not exist. Sometimes things could happen in such a way that the user might not exist, the user is deleted or stuff like that, and that way we want to prevent from errors. Now if I reload the page I can see the same record here as well. If I just zoom it in, you can see now we have records here. So now if I just uncomment everything here, and just for the sake I am going to put multiple BRs, reload the page, you can see now both works, but both have parent and child relationships, and they work inversely and directly as well, and both is giving me the pure and correct result. Okay, so that's a brief introduction of one-on-one relationships. I hope that video finds interesting, and I will see you in the next one.